look at it and we say, what do you think a barn was used for? And then you can have the children raise their hands and they can give you suggestions. They used it for the animals. They used it for their farm machinery. They used it for this. Ask for suggestions. It helps you to get along quicker. And then you don't have to talk so much yourself. The kids will talk too. The Garrison house was built in the 1690s, and when they first came here, they probably did not have a large barn like you see today. What they probably had was just this little section like right here. And now I'll show you what I mean when we go inside. Do I have to look at you all the time?
No.
Okay. I hope it's open today. Probably breaking something. I don't know if I'm supposed to even be opening this, but they told me to show this the next time. I'm not sure how to open this. I might have to get Louise. You might want to only had a little section of barn, not a large one. The larger one probably came in the late 1700s when the farmers had more animals. When they first came to Chelmsford, they may have had 1 or 2 cows, and then they probably would have had a smaller lean-to on another piece of the property. So when they first moved in the late 1600s, all they had was probably a little section of barn. And in the little section of barn, it was probably just large enough for a wagon and the hay loft, because hay and wheat and rye and whatever else they grew was their main staple of food for the animals and for themselves, to make bread, muffins, and that kind of stuff. So when you come in, this is probably the section of barn that they had. And the hay loft is inside, and there's a big enough spot for the wagon. But we can't get in there right now, so we won't show that part. I usually have the children come into this section right here, and we just talk for a few minutes. What was life like back in the 1690s? Did they have this? Did they have that? You can make up your own stuff. Look at the script and just talk, and that's what I like to do. I like to have like a talking relationship with the children instead of just me babbling on and on. They get bored. Okay, then you can start pointing out some of the different, my corn, the different pieces of equipment. Like right here, this is labeled and it says it's a cranberry sorter. Now there is a working cranberry bog still in Chelmsford on the Chelmsford-Westford line, and they still get cranberries out of it. Now you can ask the children, what kind of things can you make out of cranberries? There's cranberry sauce, there's cranberry juice, there's cranberry jelly, and they used all of these things to make whatever they needed to make. And the cranberries would go in the top, and then they'd turn their crank and squeeze out the juice, and they'd have the pulp left, and they would also have the juice. Now right here, this is a thing called a treadmill. And this is something you could ask the children about also. What is a treadmill used for? Today, treadmills are used for exercise, but that's not what they were used for back then. They would actually put a horse on the treadmill, and he would just keep walking and walking and walking. And what this actually was a form of power or electricity. And then they might hook up the cranberry sorter to this, and then they'd let the animal do all the work, and they wouldn't have to keep struggling and struggling to move, the crank on the cranberry sorter. So this was nice, but not everybody had one of these, of course. Then you can come over here and show this. This is a cheese press. They mixed all of their ingredients in here. I'm not sure what they were, their milk and their cream. And then they would have a net on the bottom, and they would squeeze all the juice out, and they would have these perfect molds. And these are nice. And the barn usually was a place that they may have stored foods like this. If they had milk or cheese or perishables, the barn was always nice and cool. And it was cool because of they didn't actually have a cement floor, they had a stone floor. And this was nice and cool, and especially in the summertime. So we have the cheese press. I always let the children pick up this shovel. And they can't break it, so I let them touch it. And it is carved out of one piece of wood. So just the job of carving this out was a feat in itself. So you can let them hold this. It's very heavy. And then you can say to, wouldn't it be hard to use something like this all day? I always say, it kind of made, I wonder if the men were like Arnold Schwarzenegger's back then. They must have had big muscles trying to use shovels like this, but you can use your own jokes. This is a winnowing basket, and you can see the ladies in the background using it. They would put their stalks of wheat on it with the seed heads, and the ladies would go like this with the basket and move it all around, and all the seeds would fall off, and that's what they wanted, the seed heads. They couldn't make the bread or whatever with the, the stalks itself. They needed the seed heads, and that's what they would pound down and make into flour. So this is what they would use. This is a, most people did have one of these, in the 1690s. But some people did have winnowing machines, but this was a cheap version. They probably all had one of these. And you can show them the picture here. Then you can show them the pitchforks. There's a long-handled one, and there's the small wooden one. Now, they probably had the wooden one when they first came because the blacksmith wasn't available. All they had was wood, so they had to make all of their things. And then when they had a blacksmith available, they had metal ones. And then you can point out how this one's long and that one's short. Why do you think they had the long one? And you can ask the children this question. You get many answers, but the real answer is for being able to take the hay and putting it way up into the hayloft. Plus, it also saved their backs using the longer one. These are some ice tongs that they used in the wintertime to get ice, and I'll show you more about that over there. My corn. This is a corn planter. Now they would put the corn kernels, which are on here, put them inside, turn the crank, and they'd have to move this along the field, and individual pieces of corn would be planted along the rows. A lot of times they just took the corn and they just did it by hand too. But this was a corn planting machine. These flails right here, there's a picture of the men using them. This was another way to get the seed heads off of the wheat, like the winnowing basket, except they used these long things right here, and here's one right here. And the men would actually just take this, and just whip it around, and that would take the seed heads off of the stalks too. Okay, then we can go around the corner. And over here we have a corn stalk chopper. Now this would take the whole corn stalk. You see them out now for Halloween, the big long corn stalk. You put the whole stalk in here and it chops it up. Now they would use the corn stalk choppings for their mattresses. And you can see this inside the house. Somebody will show them inside the house how they stuff their mattresses with it. Here was a sling for injured animals in the barn. You probably have seen this before. It goes right underneath their belly, and it lifts them up off the ground, so they won't move their legs and they can heal. Now here is where they may have had a hayloft in the middle of the barn. They would go up the stairs, and this was probably open right here. All of these pieces of the roof would be open, and they could just, put all the hay up there. And this was a thing that they had out for the fields. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but especially in Pennsylvania where they have a lot of crops, they would take a whole bunch of the wheat with this thing, and they would make their bundles out of it. So if you've ever gone by a field and you've seen a bundle here and a bundle there, they would use something like that. It's pretty nifty. All the tools they had were really nifty, and they served their purpose. Whatever they needed, they made, and it was for a specific reason, and they worked. Okay, then we can go to all these apparatus right here was for the ice making. It was not really for ice making, for ice chopping and cutting. Making ice, or getting the ice from streams, was very important back in the 1690s and early 1700s and through the 1700s because it was a big business. They would take ice from the streams and ponds all around New England, and they would ship it to Boston. Now, they would do this because all of the water around Boston is salt water. So they couldn't really use that for preserving food or whatever because of the salt in it. So farmers around New England and Chelmsford, Westford, cut up ice, and they used to float it to Boston. I thought that was pretty cool. And there's a picture right here of some men chopping it up and the ice going up the conveyor belt, and probably a whole bunch of wagons over here, and they load it onto the wagons. And here's some big saws. You can point out the saws. And a lot of work it must have been to cut the ice. With a saw like this, they used to have to do it by hand. They probably got really tired. And there's a picture right here. Here's some tongs. Just these themselves, they're so heavy. I don't know how they did it, but they did. This could be a, put it right into the ice and they drag it along. They may have put the ice on a wooden sled like this. They had a lot of these around the farm. Sometimes they use these in the winter times for the kids for play. They did play once in a while. But most of the time they put maybe ice, or after they milked the cows, they had the buckets here, and they would bring it to the house. Here's an old barrel. Now, they may have had water in here during the dry summer months. If it rained, they would collect the rainfall, and they would use the water. Here's a long-handled bucket. Then you can ask the children about this. Why do you think you need a long handle on this bucket? And then you can ask for you can wait for their replies. And the reason is, if you went to the stream and the water level was low, you don't want to have to walk down into the water to get the water. So you would just use this, and you could just lower it right down. Fill it up and bring it back up. That was another nifty thing. I like that. All the kids are going to ask about this. Now, they probably didn't have one of these. What it is it checks the acidity of vinegar. Now, to make vinegar back then, it was probably an apple cider vinegar. When there's an apple press around the corner that I'll show you. They had the apple cider, and they used to keep it in these barrels, and they would just let it sit and sit and sit. And every so often, they would test the acidity, if it's good for this or good for that. Sometimes they used it for vinegar. Sometimes they let it sit around a lot longer, and they'd make moonshine or booze, and the kids get a chuckle out of that. They probably didn't have one of these. They just probably tasted it and said, oh, that's good. Here's some things for the horses. They always had to wear all these harnesses and equipment. Oh, where's my corn again? I just keep forgetting that. Now, this is a corn sheller. They would actually take the whole piece of corn, just like this, off of the stalk, and put it in here, turn this crank, and all these kernels would fall off. And this was pretty nifty. And they would use the kernels for cooking, pound them down to make flour and cornmeal, or for the animal feed. Or they would save the seeds for the next planting season. More horse things, stirrups. Now, when we go around the corner, I always ask the kids, what do you think they use this for? It's a fire extinguisher. And I would say, did they have one of these 300 years ago? And some kids go, yes. And you go, no. What might they have used if there was a fire? And then you ask for suggestions again. Water, dirt. They might have smothered it with a cloth or something like that. But they did not have one of these. Then we come to a storage area where they may have stored a lot of their equipment. Like I said, when they first moved in 300 years ago, they only had a little barn. But as time went by, and 100 years might have gone by, and the person that moved in here, the Adamses, only lived here for a short period of time, maybe 50 years, and then they sold it to somebody else, and the person that bought it probably had more cows and more animals, and that's when they built a bigger barn. And these structures right here were for the cows. And then they would have had a storage area, like I said over here, where they put their extra plows and all their planting materials. You don't really have to show too much over there. It's just old plows and not anything that the kids would really be interested in. And now this was another exhibit. So there used to be there was a cider thing right here. Oh, there it is over there. Oops, sorry. Here's the cider press. They use this on Sunday, so that's why it's here. But this bucket goes over here, and that goes inside there, and you turn this crank, and all the apple juice comes out, and they'd have apple cider. That's what that is. Okay, then you can have them go this way. Now this is an important part right here. I always have fun with the kids right here. The horseshoes. If you show them the horseshoes, I want you to have them look at the difference in them. These are flat, and these have spikes. Ask them why these might have been flat. Ask them why these were like this. You get a lot of responses to that. But what they actually are is the flat ones are for the summer, and the spiky ones are for the winter. It makes sense. When it's winter time, the roads must have been very slick, and the horses couldn't get up, some of them, with their heavy wagons. So they would put these for the winter ones, and then they could dig in. It really makes sense. Come, put your hand over here when you're talking so they can't read it, because they'll look at it and go, they'll know the answer right away. And the ones down here are for the marsh shoes, which they would have used where it was muddy or wet, like in the cranberry bogs. Then the horses wouldn't sink down so far. I think those are cool. Then you can show them the rest of the barn right here, which is a lot of just different types of supplies or items that they would have had. Like right there in the corner is an ox yoke, really for oxen, which is 2, and they would put those over their heads, and they would use that when they were plowing the field. And then here is a grindstone. They would have used this for sharpening their plow heads, or knives, or whatever. Now right over there, they're going to ask what that thing is with the spiky things. There's one of them in the house. And what it was used for was for flax. Now flax is something that they grew in the garden, and they used to spin it in a spinning wheel. Now if you take a piece of a plant, how do you spin that? Well, you take that sharp thing, and you actually take the plant, and you just like pull it through. And then the plant becomes like a fiber, and it's actually gets kind of like yarn, and then they can spin it. And with the flax, they used to make linen, and they used to make dresses. Imagine a dress out of linen. Must have been scratchy. You can show them the different plows right here, different types for different types of soil. This one might have been used for if there was a lot of rocks. And you can see how it's longer than that one, so the rocks would have been pushed out of the way. There's a couple of different things over there. There's a couple of boxes. A milking stool. They may have stored some of the vinegar or wines in those type containers. Doesn't look like there's too much more left, but you can see the structure for the cows again. I don't know if they want to go into this, but I don't know if you want to shut it off for a second. Okay, a couple more things.
Okay. So where do you want to be?
These are from an exhibit, and I don't know if they're going to show them these or not. We won't. There's usually a chair here, a modern chair that I point out, but that's not here. I guess we'll just go right over here to this. Now, back in the 1690s, when the family needed a pair of shoes, what did they do? And then you can ask the children again. And I say, could you go to Favored, the shoe store, and buy a pair of shoes? They'd all go, no. And I said, well, what would you do? And they give you a couple of responses. But what they actually did was they made their own shoes. Now here's a form for a shoe. This was probably a man's shoe. They would take the leather, and then you ask them, where did they get the leather? And they actually got it from the cows that they killed. They would take the piece of leather, put it over the form of the shoe, and they'd have their workbench right here, and they'd, form it around it, and they'd, fix it up, and they'd put the buttonholes, and they'd make their own shoes. And this could be a pair of shoes that they made. They don't look too good right now, but they were serviceable. This would be a typical shoe that they probably made. There was a piece of stronger leather at the bottom and more flexible type leather at the top. This may have been a child's shoe. And this was probably about the size of a lady's shoe. Now, the people were very short and tiny back then because they didn't get enough to eat sometimes, and they didn't have a lot of vitamins and nutrients. So this is a child's, this is a woman's, and this is a man's. Is the telephone here? I always pick this up and say, did they have one of these back then? And they all go, no. I hope they all say no, but they did not, of course. Now, when they made their shoes, not every farmer or every person could make shoes, of course. So they used to have this system where people would come over and say, can you make me a pair of shoes? I need a pair of shoes. And he would say yes, but then they would have a bartering system where the person that came over, he might give him a couple gallons of milk. He might give him some corn. The farmer was short that year. So they would have a type of trading system. This man would make shoes, somebody else would have something else. So they used to trade off, which was good. And over here, this is a scythe. Now this is in the script. It's hard to say, and this is a sickle. They would use this for harvesting some of the corn. Now, they would take this and they would just kind of whack it near the bottom of the plant, and this would take the whole plant right down. Now, if they didn't have any machinery or anything to harvest the corn or the wheat, they would have to use something like this. So this was really hard work to take this out and to harvest your crop. It would take a long time, and you get pretty tired doing that. And this right here is a sickle, and they use this probably for smaller plants or maybe weeds, and they would just cut it like this. Don't have the children touch the sharp objects, of course. This is, if they ask what this is just a support. After 300 years, the roof of the barn is getting kind of saggy. So every so often, I think down there, all those supports, those are all things that they've added later, so the barn will collapse, actually. That's what this is. Ask the children what they think this is. What it actually is the thing that they used to have on their shoulders, and they would put buckets at either end, and they would walk with the buckets to the house or wherever they were going. Now the last thing I like to show is all these little pieces of equipment right here. You can show them some horseshoes, and then they could probably touch some of them. See how heavy they are. The horses used to have to walk with these things. I like to show the cowbells. I like to go like that. Why do you think they needed cowbells? And then you can ask the kids what they think. The real reason is the farmer lets the cows out in the morning. It's time for milking. They look everywhere. Where are the cows? They would listen. The cow that had the cowbell on would go down to take some grass, and it would make a noise. Every time the cow bends over, it would make a noise. Then they knew where the cows were, so they would probably send out one of the children and say, go get the cows. Here's an old pair of grass clippers for cutting the grass. Here's another bell. And here's some old ice skates. They did have some fun sledding and probably skating. And that's about it. Then you'll probably go to the house. I only do the house and the barn.
Quiet on the set. Wait.
Okay. My name is Dina, and I'm going to show you how to teach the children how to make soap. When you arrive here, you'll find lye and water mixed together already in the bowl. The tallow or the lard will already be melted. And when the children arrive, what you'll need to do is add the other ingredients and explain to the children how it was done in the colonial days. Now, here I already have the lye and the water mixed in the bowl, and the way colonial people got their lye was to get it from the ashes in the fireplace, put in a leach barrel. The leach barrel was made from a birch log, and we have a birch log here on the table. The father would hollow out a birch log and set the ashes inside, and then you put water through the ashes, and then the log would have a hole in the bottom so that the water would drain out, the lye would drain out, and if it wasn't strong enough, they would just put in fresh ashes and keep doing over and over again. The way they decided if it was strong enough was to take an egg from the hen house and drop it in the bucket of lye. And if the egg floated, the lye was ready. And if the egg sank, then you had to put it back through again. So the next ingredient from the lye is the grease, or the lard. Now we have lard in a container like this from the supermarket. Colonial people would have gotten their lard from fat from the butchering, pieces of fat that they would melt it down, and this is real greasy. So you add that, and once you have all the ingredients, then you let the children stir. So you have the lye, and then you add, this is a 1/4 cup of ammonia. And it's going to smell awful. And a tablespoon of borax. Now you just keep stirring, and the children will be all around the edges of the table. And you have your bowl set here, and the person on the end here can stir a little bit. And it's very, very important that you always stir in the same direction. Always, I'm going in a clockwise direction now, and you should always go in that way or the soap won't set up right. So this first child will stir, then you send him or her back around to the end of the line, and everyone moves up a little bit so that you don't have to move the bowl. The children move, and they all get a chance to stir the soap. Now you have to stir the soap for 2 hours, so you'll only be making one batch of soap for the 2 groups that come in the morning. The second group, you have to just explain to them about the ingredients and just let them stir the soap. Then when the group comes in the afternoon, you make another batch of soap. Once the soap is finished, after 2 hours, you put it in a shoebox like this with a sheet in it, and then it sets up, and this is how it looks when it's hard. And then that hard piece of soap will be cut up into pieces, and each child will get to take home a little bag of soap like this to take home with them. Just recap a little on the ingredients. We use 6 cups of melted lard, a 1/2 can of the lye, and the lye comes in a can like this, but it's very dangerous, and you can see what it does to our spoons. So make sure you point that out to the children, how dangerous it is, and that they shouldn't put their hands in it. You shouldn't have your hands in this while it's setting up and you're stirring. We have the water, the ammonia, and the borax. Now, colonial times, they didn't make a little shoebox full like this. They made a whole big barrel full of soap, and they did that once or twice a year. So they needed 23 pounds of lard, which was they called tallow, and that would come from the butchering of the animals and the cooking, and they would melt down all the fat from the butchering and the cooking. They also needed 6 bushels of ashes just to make enough lye to make a barrel of soap. They also did this over the fire. I don't know if you can get this picture. They did it outside, like on a tripod, over a fire. People wash their clothes, usually about once a month, or even during the wintertime, it could be as long as once every 3 months. When you add all these ingredients together, it's a good idea to add the ammonia last, and that way the fumes from the ammonia aren't as bad. Let's see. Is that it?
You're set.
Hi, today we're at the herb garden, which would really be the colonial woman's drugstore. Here she would grow all of the spices and all of the herbs she would use for both medicinal purposes and for spicing the meat and curing the meats to save them for the winter. Back then they didn't have freezers and they didn't have refrigeration, so they would dry and cure and spice a lot of the meats to save them for the winter time. Also, they didn't have a pharmacy like we have CVS down the street, so they would grow herbs for sore throats, for burns, and for anything like that that the family would need. And she would dry them, and as we get into the house, you'll see in the buttery that we have dried herbs hanging where she would keep them so that she could make them into teas or plasters to use for whatever they needed to be done for. Now we're going to move on to another area that I wanted to point out of interest to you. When we get to this point of the tour, we're going to ask the children what they think this piece of stone might be used for. And we'll get a lot of answers. We'll get things like a bird bath, or a horse trough, or something to feed the animals with. What it really is a sink. Now, it was the children's job to keep this sink free of debris, and as we can see today, because of the rain we had last night, they would have had quite a job emptying this out and keeping it clean, because when they come in from working in the fields, they would come here and wash the mud off their hands before they went in the house, because they only cleaned the house twice a year. That's where our spring and fall cleaning come from. They were just too busy doing all the other chores that they needed to do to keep alive to worry about sweeping out the floor and keeping everything clean every day. And this flagpole looks very different from the ones that we have today. Can you point out what's different about this? The difference is that it's wood and it's made out of one solid log. Now today, ours are usually made of metal. Now don't forget, in colonial times, this would not have had an American flag. What kind of a flag would it have had on it? Right, it would have had an English flag until the Revolutionary time, when they put on the type of flag that Betsy Ross made with the 13 stars for the original 13 colonies. Now as we come around to this front part of the house, imagine yourself stepping back 300 years to the time when Pelatiah Adams moved here with his family from Concord, Massachusetts. The original part of this house, which is this part here, was built in 1691 from the lumber and the stone that was found on this lot. And as we move to the front of the house, imagine yourself stepping back in time 300 years. As we come into the Adams room, as we call it, this room represents what the family lived in 1691. If you notice, there's no ceiling, there's no plaster on the walls, they're just rough-hewn boards on the floor. And the centerpiece of the room is this stone fireplace. Now in 1691, we didn't have brick in this country. So these stones actually came from out in the field, and they were chipped off one by one flat, and they were put together with clay instead of with mortar. Mortar wasn't known in this country at that time, so they were stacked one on one, so you can imagine what a big job it was to chip them off and to drag them over here to build this. Now this would have had to have been put in place before the rest of the house was built around it. The house is what's called post and beam construction, and this big beam here is called a summer beam. And this comes from one tree, so you can imagine how big the tree was that this came from. And the technique that they used to build this was they would cut the tree down, and then they would chisel off one side of the tree and then they'd flip it over to that flat side and chisel off the other 3 sides. And you have to remember that they didn't have heavy equipment like we have today. This was all done by manpower and horsepower. So it was a tremendous undertaking to build a house like this. And all these cross beams were all hand-hewn to fit through here. And the way that they would do it is they would chisel it out and mark the beam and mark this beam with a Roman numeral, 1, 2, 3, 4. So when they came to put the house together, it would be like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and you'd know which beam would fit into which hole. Okay, we're going to come back to the fireplace now. Now the fireplace is the center of the home for 2 reasons. It was the only source of heat, so you want to tell the children that it was very important because in the wintertime we all know how cold it is around here. So they would have to keep a fire going 24 hours a day. And if the fire ever went out, they would have to go to a neighbor's and borrow some embers or coals from their fire to restart the fireplace because they didn't have matches at this time. So it was very important to keep the fire going, and to do this, they would bank the embers at night and put a covering on them in order to keep it nice and warm. And then in the morning, it would be one of the older boys' jobs to put more logs on and to get it going again. Because the other reason it's the center point of the room is because all the cooking was done here. Now, you have to remember that to cook a meal, they couldn't just go to the Purity and buy something. They had to hunt for it or catch it. They had to clean it, and then they had to cook it. So it was quite an undertaking to just maintain your daily necessities back then. Okay, now the next point of interest we want to show the children is this box. Now, as you all know at school, you were taught that every family would have one very important book in the family. And the book was, can anybody guess? Right, the book was the Bible. This is how the children learned to read at the very beginning times of colonial days, because most of the towns didn't have schools yet, and the children were too valuable helping the family working in the fields and taking care of everything that had to be taken care of in the family. And in order to give it a place of honor and to keep it nice and dry and safe, they would build a beautiful box like this to hold it in. And every night the mother or the father would read Bible lessons and the children would learn verses. And this is basically how they had early education. Now, as you look around the room, you see that the parents' bed would have been here. Now, during the day, this would have flipped up against the wall to make more room for the family to do their chores and to live in the room. Now, this bed is very different from the beds we have today. Can anyone guess what this mattress is filled with? Doesn't sound very comfortable, does it? It's actually made out of straw? Nope, that's a real good guess. Hay? Nope. It's corn husk. And the reason they use corn husk is because hay could be fed to the animals, but corn husks weren't good for anything else. And colonial people were very, very thrifty, and they used everything. They didn't waste anything. So in the fall, after another harvest, they'd dump out the old corn husks and put new ones in. And sometimes, in order to make it smell good, they'd put sweetgrass in there, too. Now, the other thing about this bed, if you notice, is it's a rope base. It doesn't have a box spring like we have today. And there's an old saying that says, good night, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite. And that's because after you lay on rope for a while, it stretches. So there was a way to knot these up tighter as the rope stretched. And because the corn husks are a natural medium, something natural, they did have bed bugs in their beds. So that was a nice, sweet way of telling people that we think of it as a nursery rhyme today, but back then, this was part of their everyday life. We'll come over here, and this table is all handmade. Now, back in those days, when the colonists came over here from England, there was no room on the boat for them to bring a lot of their possessions. So they were lucky to just bring a change of clothes, maybe a few small things with them. So when they came here, there were no furniture stores like we have today. So they had to be able to make things that they needed. And this table is all handmade. And things out of metal were very expensive back then. So even nails were very expensive because everything was imported from England. So they devised a very special way to put things together, and that was with pegs. These little round things are little wooden pegs, And that would be one of the boys' jobs, or one of the older men who couldn't do other work's jobs, was to whittle pegs. So that when they put this together, or in this post and beam construction also, they're all wooden pegs that are holding the joints together. Now, another thing about this table is you'll notice that there's striping on the wood. Now, can anybody tell me what animal this reminds you of? Now, some of the children will say that it reminds them of a zebra or whatever. This is called tiger's maple. And it's very, very rare wood. It used to grow in this part of the country. Unfortunately, it doesn't anymore because we used it all up. But when we come over here, we ask the children not to touch this because it is so old and so rare. And if everybody touched it and it got broken, we could never replace it. Now, another thing is, as we look around the room, we see that this was a multi-purpose room. They do their spinning here, they do their candle dipping here, they did their cooking here, they did all kinds of chores here. So this table is called a gate leg, and it folds up, so it's only this wide, and they push it against the wall when it wasn't mealtime. So these people were very creative, and they really made use of every item and every space. Now we're going to step forward in time about 100 years to what we call our Haywood room. And the reason we call it our Haywood room is because the Adamses who lived here sold the house to the Haywoods from Billerica in the early 1800s. And they moved on. So this room looks a lot more like our rooms of today, doesn't it? It has some wallpaper, it has rugs on the floor, it has a plaster ceiling, and the fireplace is now made of brick. And they have a beautiful china cupboard with some beautiful china from England now. So this family is doing very well at this point. Now this room is actually a mirror image of the room we were just in. It's just updated by about 100 years. So as you can see, they now are using brick instead of stone in the other fireplace. They're using mortar instead of clay. And they've closed in this fireplace. It's no longer this whole wall. So we know that they're only using this fireplace now to heat the room as opposed to cooking in it also. Now this room looks a lot more like our family rooms and living rooms of today, where it's a multi-purpose room. They probably have eaten or played games here. They have a sofa for inviting their favorite guests. And they have a piano for entertainment because they didn't have TV back then the way we do. So after dinner or on a Sunday after church, they gather around and sing hymns or sing songs and entertain the family. Now this town has also grown because, as we can see, they now have a newspaper. And they have time for leisure. Everything isn't work anymore. They can now play dominoes, they can play the piano, they can read. So life has really changed by the time they've come to this point in history. Now we're going to step back in history again to the year 1702. Palatai Adams had two sons, which in the records he called dutiful sons, which means that they were very good boys. And they had gotten to the age where they wanted to get married. And Chelmsford had grown as quite a bit of a village by then, and land was expensive. The Adamses were getting older, and they needed help on the farm still. So they said, we'll add rooms for you and your brides, and you'll stay here and you'll help us work the land, and we'll all live together as one big family. So this house in 1702 became one of the first two-family homes in the town of Chelmsford. Now, as you can see, in 1702 they did have brick and they did have mortar, but you can see that this is, again, used for cooking as well as heating. And over here is called a beehive oven, and this would have been used for baking breads, cookies, pies, this type of thing, because it was much more efficient than just cooking it over the open hearth. Now down here, you'll find what we call boot jacks. Again, when the kids come in, you'll say, what do you think the silly looking thing like that would have been used for? Now, if you remember, they washed their hands in that stone basin out by the side of the house. They didn't want to reach down and take their muddy boots off, because then their hands would be all muddy again, and they didn't wash in the house, they washed outside. So in order to use the boot jack, you'd step on the back like this, and you put the back of your boot here and pull it out. And the boot would stay here by the fire where the mud would dry and they could brush it off and the leather wouldn't be ruined and they'd be nice and warm when they got back in them. And they didn't soil the rest of the house because they were right here by the brick and you had to sweep out the fireplace anyway, so it really worked out well. Now when they added on these back two parts of the house, they added on this room, which would have been their kitchen or their keeping room because they also lived in here. It was their living room and their cooking room. They added on a small bedroom. Now later on, when they moved the bedrooms upstairs, this would have become a sick room or a birthing room or a boarding room because the person that needed the attendance would be right here, right off the kitchen or the keeping room and the fireplace, so that if they needed anything, it'd be very easy for the person who was working out there cooking and keeping the house to tend to. This spinning wheel is much smaller than the one we saw in the Adams room. Can anyone guess why? Well, this wasn't used for spinning wool. This was used for spinning flax. Now this is the flax weave, and as you can see, it's very brittle and tough. And what you do is you take the flax comb and you take a chunk of these and hit it and pull it and hit it and pull it, and these are very sharp metal spikes, and they would break off the husky part, the flax. And what you'd be left is are these silky fibers. Now you take these silky fibers and you'd spin them over the wheel and you'd end up around here with linen threads. Now they would use linen for their summer clothes, and they also used them for sheets and towels and that type of thing. And that's where today our word linen for sheets and towels and tablecloths come from, because originally they really were linen. We're going to step into the other side of the two-family house now, and we're going to step very much forward in time. And this kitchen is pretty much like a kitchen in this country would have been in the 1920s. Now that's probably pretty much like the grandparents that you have grew up in. Instead of a fireplace, they're just using the fireplace as a chimney now, and they have a cast iron stove. Now they still would have cooked with wood, but they would have put wood in here, and they were able to regulate it a little better. And instead of having to hang pots over the fire, they could use it on the burners. And they could cook multiple things and have a lot more control. Over here, they have a rough sink, so we see that they are also doing a lot more chores the way we do them today, where they're washing up and doing things in the house instead of outside, because they have ways to clean better now than they used to. Over here, we have a big wooden box. Can anyone tell me what you think this could be used for? This is called an ice box. And this is what they used to have before they had refrigerators like we have today. And the iceman would come a couple times a week and put a big chunk of ice down here, and it would keep things cold for a couple of days until the ice melted. Now at the very bottom there'd be a big pan to catch all the drips, because as we know, ice melts. And that would be another chore that children would do. They'd have to put the drip pan out every day and dump the water and put it back in. And I'm sure that there were many kitchen floors that were flooded back then. And I'm sure there were a lot of little boys that got a lot of punishment because they didn't do their chores. And here we have what we call today our weaving room. This is what would have been the other forning or bedroom that was built on to this side for the other brother. Today we have it set up to show you how they would do their own sewing, and there may have been a loom in here for doing weaving, or for doing quilting they would have had a rack set up. And they were just busy all the time, so at night when it was too dark to do other work, Then they would sit down and do some of their other household chores that they could do at night. This is the buttery that I had mentioned to you before, and as you can see from the ceiling, those are the herbs and spices that are drying. And over here is a wooden butter churn. In the craft house, you made butter in a small glass churn, but this would have been for a family that kept several cows, and they would have been able to make a big batch of butter at one time. There are also cheese boxes, and some of these pans would have been used to lay out milk, fresh milk, so the cream would rise to the top, and they could scoop the cream off for making other things. They would have stored a lot of their things in here, and this room would have been used for baking and for doing a lot of other chores that were done around the house. Okay, now we're going to move upstairs. Now, originally when this house was built, the upstairs was just one big open room, like a loft. And there would have been an opening here with a ladder. And the children would have slept upstairs after about the age of 6. Before the age of 6, there would have been a trundle bed that pulled out from under the parents' bed, and the young children would have slept together, 2, 3, 4 to a bed in this trundle bed. And the baby would have slept in a cradle near the fireplace. Can anyone tell me why the baby would have slept by the fireplace? You're right. They would have slept there because it was the warmest place in the room. Now, not all children made it to adulthood, so they took every precaution to let the children stay healthy, because in the winter it was very drafty in here, and that was the warmest and safest place for the babies to be. Now we're going to take you upstairs and show you what the house was made like around 1800. They moved the bedrooms upstairs, much like we have them today. Now this would have been a children's room. Now this only shows one child, but usually the children would sleep all together in a nursery, or 2 or 3 brothers or 2 or 3 sisters would share a room. As you could notice, there were no closets, and all the clothes are hung on pegs or hooks on the wall. So their life was very different than we have it today. Over here you can see the top part of the fireplace we looked at downstairs, and you can see more of the single stones that were used and all of the clay that was used to hold it together, so we can get an idea of really how much bigger this really is from what we saw downstairs, and how much work was involved in building this before they built the rest of the house. Up here we get more of an idea of what the rough hewn beams are like too, and we can see where some of them are missing with age. And this is where the new addition was started. This was originally the back wall of the house with these rough hewn beams, and you can see that these were not going to be exposed because originally they were covered with the outside wall, so they left them very rough. There's bark here, and they're really not shaped the way we would shape our lumber today. And we can see where the back fireplace was built, and it is brick all the way up. And we can see that the roof slants down in a salt box effect. And this is actually the back of the addition. Over here we're going to see the master bedroom. And we can see that they had a canopy bed with a quilt. And the quilt was used for warmth in the wintertime because there was no central heat, if you remember, so it would be very cold up here. And under the bed, again, there would be a trundle bed that would pull out for the youngest children. And the newborn would be in the cradle up here with the mother, so if it needed the mother in the middle of the night, she would be right here to tend to it. Now, a lot of times they would have bedclothes or draperies that would go around the bed, and that would actually be to keep the drafts out and keep them warm in the winter. Now, in the spring and summer, they would have taken those down in order so it wouldn't be so hot up here and it would let more fresh air in. This is the type of ladder that they would have had downstairs to come up here when it was just an open loft. and all the children would have just slept up here. And you can imagine how cold it would be in the winter and how hot it would be in the summer. So life was very tough for these people. Now we're going to come into the Garrison room. Now this room is very special to us, and very special because there aren't too many houses left like this in New England. Originally, a garrison house was built to protect against Indian attacks. Now, Chelmsford didn't really have problems with Indians, but there were a lot of towns around that did, so that when this town was being built, they decided that they'd have several outposts in Chelmsford. And this is the last garrison house left in Chelmsford. All the others have been torn down. Now, this room is very different in a lot of ways because you can see how big the panels are. Now, these mean that this would have had to come from one tree. So you can imagine how big these trees were and how old they were. From here to here is one tree. Now, these boards are made so that they fit together like this. And that's how the boards on the outside of the house are too. And that's called shiplap. And the reason they do this is to keep as much of the wind and the cold and the snow out, so that when the cold winter comes, it'll keep the house as airtight as possible. Now, the Garrison was Pelotai Adams, two of his sons, and a few other of his sons that didn't live in this house. They lived in neighboring houses, and then a few of his neighbors down the street. There were 8 men assigned here, so that under threat of Indian attack, they would have all come here, and the men would have stayed in this room, and they would have had a cot similar to this to sleep on, with just a bedroll, which is like a blanket or a quilt rolled up. And they would have stayed here, and their families would have stayed in the rest of the part of the house. And the women would have collectively worked together to cook the meals and take care of the children and feed everyone. And so this was considered a safe house, because when the Indians would attack, they wanted the colonists to leave. So they would try and burn the houses down. Now, there is a myth about this time that we have no real evidence of, but there is something that's been passed down from generation to generation, that at one point there were actually holes along the base here so that the men could shoot their guns out at the Indians under attack. So another thing I wanted to point out is that this door, if you notice, is also one board. So all of the wood used in this room is very special and very strong. Later on, it probably would have been used as a storage room or as another room for the family to use. But at the early part of the time that the family lived here, and there were Indians in Chelmsford, this is when it would be used. Most of the Indians were very friendly to the settlers, and they taught them how to grow the crops the best and where the best fishing holes were and how to trap the best game. But it came to a time when the Indians felt that the colonists were taking over most of their land and were moving into areas of land that the Indians didn't want them in, and they just decided that they wanted the colonists out because they didn't have the same respect for nature and for the land that the Indians had, because the Indians had lived here for centuries and had not taken over things. Well, I hope you've enjoyed your tour of the Garrison house today, and I hope that you remember a lot of...
I'm showing you how to make butter today. This will be the first demonstration in the craft house. So when the children come in, the coordinator will ask them to remove their jackets, their hats, whatever, and lay them on the chairs, and then they'll bring them to your station. When the coordinator brings the children over, make sure they line up on the 3 sides of the table and then the front. Ask them please not to lean on the tables because we don't want any tables collapsing or anybody getting hurt. You also want to ask them not to touch anything on the table. We will be showing it to them and letting them look at it, but we don't want them to play with the molds and stamps. Another thing too, sometimes the children will try to move around so that they can be first in line or get a turn. I always tell them to stay where you are. We'll start at one end of the table and work our way around so everybody gets a turn. Now, back up a little bit. Whoever's doing butter should come a few minutes early and start churning the butter right away because it takes a little bit longer than the 20 minutes you're allowed. And this is basically, you will use the small churn, it will be on the table. You'll get 2 cups of heavy cream from the refrigerator, put it in the churn, screw the top on, and basically start cranking. When you get a consistency close to whipped cream, you want to stop and put the churn back in the refrigerator and wait for the children to come in before you actually start churning again, because you want to give each of them a chance to try to do some churning. After the children arrive, the coordinator introduces you. And what I do then is I always greet the students and say, good morning, how are you? Have you ever made butter before? And basically start going into the script. You can have the script on the table with all the questions. And the answers are there too, so that, you know, you can kind of help the children along in that. Then, after I showed them what I'm doing, I begin at one end of the table and I ask somebody for help. I have one student start the handle. A second student should always hold the churn like this so it doesn't slip off the table. You don't want any accidents or anything. Let each child turn the churn 4 or 5 times. And then just go down the line. While they're doing the butter churning, kind of supervise that, but keep on asking questions on the script or the paper. Start showing them these things. This is the trough, a little bit smaller version than they would have used in the colonial days. So they would put the milk there to let the cream rise to the top. This is a butter mold. They would pour their butter in, and it has a wheat on the bottom of it. So when they put their butter out, it would have a nice design on the top. This is a butter stamp. Don't let the children play with these. Just demonstrate them to them. As you're churning too, this will start changing inside. Occasionally it looks like cheese, it looks like whipped cream. Point that out to them. And the closer you get to butter, the harder it is to turn the churn. It's a little bit of elbow grease. Always make sure when you're demonstrating the churn to the children that you tell them to be very careful of the fingers and the gears. And they may get a little grease on their hands. Churn until the handle gets really hard to turn like this. And now you have butter. Okay, and then you just unscrew the top of the churn. Take the paddle out. You will, if you touch the gear, get grease on your hand. Now you take your pitcher, and now you can ask the children why you have a spoon with holes in it. Because you're going to hold this and pour the buttermilk into the pitcher. And you need to explain to the children this is not buttermilk like you would buy in the store. This is sweet, and it tastes sweet. It tastes like milk, maybe a little like a butter or 2 in it. And there's not a lot of buttermilk left over, so you just want to give them enough to have a taste, just a touch. Then after everybody has been served and had a chance to taste it, then you can offer seconds if you have any. You scoop the butter into the wooden bowl. And then you want to get all the liquid out of the butter. Because if you leave too much liquid in the butter, it spoils. Just squeeze. child. I start at one end of the table and work my way around, then I come around again with seconds. And that way everybody's sure to get some. You want to start with seconds because you need to have time to do the other demonstrations in the craft house. Always be sure that you offer the chaperones both the buttermilk and the butter if they would like some. Have the students throw their empty cups in the trash can by the door, and then the coordinator will come over and then move the group next to the soap demonstration. And that's basically it. I'm going to train you on candles at this point. When the kids leave the soap area, they're going to split up. Some will go to quilting, some will come to the candle area. Because we're working with hot water and hot wax, it's a good idea to have the children line up from the corner of the table in this fashion. There is a crack on the floor that I use as a guideline, and have the kids stand here on the crack. It keeps them a safe distance away from, again, the hot boiling water and the hot wax. When you start, you can ask them why, in fact, did they make candles. Hopefully they'll give you the right answer. There was no electricity. You talk about what the mom would do. It's in your script. The mother would set out 2 chairs back to back and have 2 long rods across. And then while she was doing this, the children would have the smaller rods, and they would be tying wicks on the rods. All of this was prepared before they even began their dipping. In colonial times, they would have used a pot similar to this outdoors on an open fire. And what they would put in that particular pot was the fat that they collected from animals, similar to when they talked about tallow in soap. Again, the word here is tallow. The tallow would be put in the pot and it would go on the open fire. But today, now modern times, we're using electric units. It's a double boiler fashion. The larger pot has boiling water. The smaller pot has the wax that is melted. Again, remember to keep the children back. At this point, you can start to talk to the kids, explain about what the mother would do to set up, and then the responsibility of the children. Once the tallow was melted, the children were the people who, in fact, would dip. They did all of the work. You can show them a rod. This is a good experience. Let them feel it, a rod with wicks that have not been dipped, and they can feel it. It feels just like string. They can pass it along in their line. Then you can show them the proper way to dip. In dipping, a good question I would always ask the kids is, how many dips does it take to make 1 candle? Now you'll notice it is behind us on the wall. 30 dips makes 1 candle. I would handle by asking it as a question. Some of the kids would pick up on the poster behind us. If not, give them the information. There is also some other props here. This is a piece of wax in the form, not melted, that you can show them, they can feel it, and they can touch it. This is bayberry wax, okay, again, unmelted. They can in fact hold it and touch it. There will be a branch on the table that will have bayberries on it. In colonial times, they would make candles out of tallow. Those candles were used on a daily basis. If it was a special occasion, they would in fact make bayberry candles. We have a poster on the wall that reflects this. The mother is making bayberry candles. What's different here, it was used for a special occasion. In order to make bayberry candles, you needed 6 quarts of bayberries. It's difficult sometimes for the kids to relate to that. I ask them if they've ever gone strawberry or blueberry picking. They can relate to the size of a quart container. It took 6 quarts of bayberries to make 1 candle. That's why they were only used for a special occasion. The sample that I have right now is an older sample. There will be a new one here when you come out on the actual school program. I'm not sure if you can see, but the bayberry itself is very small, smaller than a pea, and it is white on the outside. Bayberries, again, were put in the large pot on the open fire and boiled. The wax is the white around it. It would melt and the flesh of the berry would sink to the bottom. So it's important, I think, to let them know that a bayberry candle was made, only used for special occasion because of the work. Again, the children would have picked the bayberries, and hopefully the kids can relate to 6 quarts. Okay, in dipping your candles, you will do it, have the kids come up one by one and ask your chaperones to help you. Keep the other children back away from the wax. You want them to hold the candle rod at the very end, 2 fingers, thumbs underneath, and as they approach the pan, they will come up, dip in, and come up. At that point, after they've dipped, you want to take the candle rod from them and put the candle rod back on this rack. The reason you're doing that is the wax is in fact still dripping. So you really don't want the wax to drip on the children. You want to remind them also that they're not going to dip in and leave those candles in, because that is just going to melt away the layers of wax that are there. Your responsibility will be to take the rod off of the rack, hand it to the child next in line, have them come up and dip, retrieve the rod and put it at the back so that you are rotating these candles. By the time the rod gets back up to the first position, the wax has had enough time to dry. While the other demonstrators are going on, we're going to ask you to continually dip, even though you are not, you don't have a group in front of you. This is so we can ensure that every group that comes through will get candles. The children may ask, am I going to take these candles home? The answer is no. They will take candles that were probably made from the previous day. So while butter and soap are going on, please dip so we can ensure a good supply of candles. As your candles are being dipped and the wax starts to dry, you'll notice that the bottoms of the candles will in fact have drips hanging down that have dried. You want to snap these off and drop these pieces back into the pot. Remember to tell the children that everything was recycled. This will enable your candle to go all the way down into the pot so that it's covered up to the tip. The wax does dry quickly. Depending on your time, you can have them feel the candle. It is warm, it is not hot. When you get candles that are about this size, we're not going to count our dips, you can tell by the size or the weight, take them off and stop dipping. When you are without a group, you can actually slide these candles off. There's a knife at your station. You would cut off the bottom. And again, depending on the day and the candles, if you save a candle like this to show the group, you can actually see the rings, and the kids will be able to identify with how many dips you're talking about. You can actually see the rings similar to the rings of a tree. Once you cut off the ends, there is saran wrap under the table. We ask that you rip off a piece, wrap the candle, and then place it in the black box to the left of the table. These will be candles that will be used the following day for the next school coming in. Should a child get a drop of wax, it will dry immediately. They will feel warmth. I don't think that they will feel real heat. The reason you're having them hold the candle rods at the very end is the pot handles are hot. The pots are hot. And you should be able to let the children go through, and each child should be able to dip twice. You will get your cue from the Garrison House coordinator as to when you're ready to wrap up. But you usually have 6 to 7 children, and they should have ample time to dip twice. If you are at your station while you're waiting for your group and you find that there are rods that are empty, or you have taken candles off that are large enough, you now have the empty rod, please cut wick. There'll be a length on the table. 4 pieces of wick go on a rod. It's a square knot that you're going to tie at the top, and then put the rod back on the larger rack to go through the dipping cycle. If there is not a sample of wicking at the station, the wicking should be cut at 11 inches, so when it's tied on the rod, you will end up with a 9-inch candle. At the end of your demonstration, please come over to the hot plates and turn the hot plate off. There is a second hot plate that will have a pot of wax on it. If this wax does in fact that you can use to take wax from the second pot and pour it into the pot that you'll be dipping into. But we ask you that when you're through with your demonstration, for both halves of the class to turn the hot plates off. Thank you.
When the first settlers came to New England, they could only bring a certain amount of things with them, clothing and whatever. And of course they brought their quilts and blankets, because the warm quilts were a must. Now when the quilts wore out, they had to make new ones. And to make new ones, they had to have 3 layers of fabric: the back, the front, and the middle. Now today, we use fiber fill, raw middle, but they didn't. They used whatever they had, homespun as a rule, or they'd take apart their father's pants or old blankets. So their quilts were heavier than what ours are today. Now, materials for making quilts were hard to come by, especially out here at a farm like the Garrison house. Wool was sheared from sheep raised on this farm, and linen was broken from flax plants that may have been growing on the farm. The wool was washed, sorted, and carded. The women or girls in the family would then spin the wool or linen on a spinning wheel, just like the one you saw in the Garrison house. In order to make the yarn different colors, it was dyed or colored. Can you see this? We have a chart here. They used onion skins, black walnut hulls, tansy, goldenrod, and as you can see, their colors were not vivid like we have today. It was a long time before the cloth that came from England was very expensive. So they had to save all their scraps from all their clothing, their skirts, their aprons, in order to make a quilt. Now, all the children helped with quilt making. The little girls cut squares, and even the little boys sewed on the quilt. Now, this is called a 9-square, and every state has their own quilt pattern. And in Massachusetts, this is our pattern, the 9-patch. And usually when people learn to quilt, this is about the first one that they will do. Now the children would learn to sew the squares together, and this is how we teach them. The lines are marked, they would go in on the end, and they would do a running stitch, like this. And each child gets to take home the 2 squares that they sew. They sew to the end of the marked line, and then the instructor usually has to knotted off for them. Now when the mothers had quilts put together, they would often have a quilting bee. And this was also a social occasion for them because there were no telephones. And these farms were miles apart. Sometimes they went for weeks on end without seeing anyone. So they would come and they would work on the quilts. And then we teach the children how to tie a quilt. This is a tied quilt here. As they became more experienced in quilting, they would quilt, which is a lot of small running stitches. Now, to tie a quilt, the children will work on this quilt, and we show them, they put the needle in till it touches their finger, just pricks it. Then they bring it up and pull it almost to the end, and then they do a square knot, left over right and right over left. And then we cut it for them. And then, if you have time left, it depends on the size of your class. If you have a large class, sometimes you don't even have time to do everything. Then you show them the other patterns that were made later on. And you can see how they look. This is called Lemoyne Star, which, as you can see, is a star. This is a pine tree, which looks like a pine tree. This is called Railroad Crossing. Shoe fly. Bear claw down there, which is a favorite of people. The one next to it, I don't know if you can see it, is called Churn Dash, and that's patterned after the butter churn. If there are two mothers working, one mother will help them with the sewing, and the other mother will help tying the quilt, especially if it's a large class. We suggest that you get all your needles ready before the children get here. The quilters usually have time because they're here a good 40 minutes before they come to quilting. They thread the needle with these small needles with this kind of thread and this crochet cotton for tying the quilt. And this is how it looks. And usually, if you pin it on the edge of the quilt like this, get your needles together, then you're all set when they come. Okay. After the class leaves, the mother who is doing the quilting can cut out the knots because it has to be used over and over again. And at the end of the day, we have a sheet that we cover the quilt with, and that's another job they can do. Just cover it so it will protect it from the sun and from dirt.
Shop, and it came from South Chelmsford originally, and when it was given to us, it was cut in half and brought over the roads, and it took 2 days to get it here, one half in one day and one half the next. Cut Smith shop and come on in. If you look carefully around the blacksmith shop, you can see down the middle, right up over, and you can see where it was cut in half, and then it was put back together again. And I want you all to know that this blacksmith was one of the most important men in our town because he not only made things from iron, he also repaired things. And that's very important. The blacksmith made nails for our houses, but because this is such an early blacksmith shop, you can see that it was pegged. Didn't use many nails till later on. Now the blacksmith as I told you, was a very important man in the town. He had his fire, and he had bellows, and I wonder if you know what makes a fire hot. It's air, and air comes from the bellows. And these are the original bellows. And I'm going to tell you now about an apprentice. A blacksmith always had an apprentice. That is a young boy whose family maybe couldn't afford to keep him at home. Maybe the young boy wanted to become a blacksmith. And the easiest way to learn to be a blacksmith is to live with one and learn all his ways. To be an apprentice, you worked 7 years, and in return for your labors, the blacksmith fed you and clothed you and let you sleep. Probably he had a bed up in the top part of the blacksmith shop. We really don't know. A blacksmith first started his apprentice as the boy that worked the bellows to keep the fire burning. Now we're going to look at some of the things that a blacksmith can do. First of all, he had to make his own tools, and he no doubt started to learn to be a blacksmith by watching and seeing the tools that the blacksmith used, and he would start making them. Iron is a very We have not got the stove going this morning, so we have to pretend. But the apprentice would be working the bellows, the blacksmith would be here, and this piece of iron would get hot, red hot, and he would move it. He always wore gloves. As you see, I have no gloves. And he would bring it right over to his anvil. This is an anvil. And he would be striking it. And the wonderful thing about the anvil is when you are hitting, you are not only hitting the piece of iron on this side, but because the anvil is flat, it is also forming it on the other side. Then he'd turn it over and hit it some more. And then he'd put it back in the fire to heat it up. Now, a blacksmith is an individual, and when a blacksmith works, you can hear his ring. And I'm going to show you. You can hear it. It's like he sings a song. He goes. And I'm sure you can hear his song, and blacksmiths have different rhythms. Now, when you want, of course, blacksmiths didn't have scissors, so they cut a piece of hot iron. They take the hot piece and they put it on this, and they hit it, and because it is sharp, that is their scissors. Blacksmiths also cut his hot iron from the fire, and he has been hitting it. If he wants to cool it down, he immediately puts it in cold water, and that stops it from, it cools it immediately. Now, some of the things that blacksmiths make, besides the nails, they can take a piece of iron just like this, put it in the vise, and twist it while it's still hot. And this is what they put around it to twist it. They fit that over and just twist it around, and then they quench it, and then they look at it to see how it looks. Now, this is a very nice hook. Our ancestors liked pretty things, so they always put a little design for for them to enjoy. Another thing that the blacksmiths made was this tool, this instrument right here, and that's known as a sticking Johnny. And that was put in there, and a candle was put in, and I'm sorry to say that's how a lot of places burned down, because they put it in and forget it. This is another pretty thing that they've made, and this would go into the rafters, and that's pretty, isn't it? Now, this wonderful anvil, and you see we have a couple of anvils, and we have many, many kinds of tools. Tools to make shapes, and I'm trying to find some nails for you so you can see an old nail. There's an old one. Can you see it? Now, when a house did burn down in the old days, one of the first things they looked for in the hot coals of where the house was the nails, so they could use them again because nails were so scarce. Now let's look around the room, and can you get a good shot of all the tools in the sunlight? As you always wore a leather apron. The reason being that when the sparks flew, as he pounded, the sparks fly off leather and he won't get burned. This is to measure weights. This is a later instrument. Now over here, we're going to talk about our sleigh. Sleighs were used during the winter, and I wonder if it ever occurred to you why they used sleighs. Now you see here the blacksmith has been very busy. He made all the iron for here and all the decorative parts, and the reason we could use sleighs so long in the winter was that they didn't plow the roads, they rolled them. So you had a nice thick covering of snow on the roads, and therefore you could use your sleigh. Have you ever tried to ride a bicycle in the winter? It doesn't work when it's in the snow because you can't get a good hold. So that's why we have our little sleigh. And this is a very fancy one. And then we have another little sleigh over here. And all boys are interested in cannons. And here's one right here that's just on loan to us. But it's very interesting. And here's a pair of bellows up close so you can see them. And I know that some of you have bellows by your fireplace. We use small bellows for the same reason that the blacksmith uses them, because it gives air and makes the fire go longer. There's not a latch. When you go through the house, you will see many things that the blacksmith did do. He gave us all our latches and our kitchen tools, and I'm trying to think of what else we could talk about. Oh yes, hinges. Therefore you could close doors and open cupboards with the little iron hinges. I think it was due to the blacksmith that they had axes to cut their wood. And can you think of anything else? Have you?